Welcome back. So when we last left off, we had created the basic outline of our shitty wiki. We connected it to our database. We had a method for viewing pages and creating pages, and we built our route so that we can have friendly URLs like this. And today we're going to be adding a couple more pages to make this very wiki-like. We're going to be adding an edit page and a settings page. And we're going to necessarily have to get into authentication and authorization. Now, if you don't know the difference between authentication and authorization is the process of determining who someone is, whether that be them logging in through a username and password, maybe a third party like Facebook or Google, maybe they have a certificate, maybe they're using multi-factor authentication, but it's basically determining who you are. Authorization is the process of figuring out who is allowed to access a specific resource. It could be everyone's allowed to access it, in which case they don't need to authenticate because it doesn't matter who they are. Or different pages may be authorized to specific people, requiring different levels of authentication. If I log into my Gmail, I might just need to put in my Google password, but if I log into my YouTube, I might have to do multi-factor authentication, depending on the risk associated with that resource. So today we're going to look into creating these constructs and figuring out how the standard way of doing them in ASP.NET Core is. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and create two pages. We're going to add Razor page. We're going to add an edit page, presumably where people will edit page content. So let's let it scaffold for a second. And we're also going to add a settings page, which is going to be where administrators can control settings. Pretty soon we're going to have settings that are going to be, global for the entire website that an administrator is going to want to change or configure when they set this thing up. So that's where they're going to do that from. So once again, we're going to go to settings, and you can see that we wound up with an error. Now, in our last episode, we didn't actually run into any unhandled exceptions, so this is something new. This is what you're going to get if the code rendering your page essentially crashes. If we read the error message here, no authentication scheme was specified and there's no default challenge scheme found. So basically what it's saying is, well, I know I have to figure out who someone is in order to restrict access to this page because it requires authorization, but I don't know how to authenticate anyone, so don't really know what to do next. So let's go ahead and close this and take a look at our startup.cs. So if we scroll down, you can see that in our default template that Visual Studio created for us, authorization has been added to our application pipeline. So what this means is that every request that goes to the web server trickles through all of these different, they're called middleware, and right after it determines where we want to go, it determines whether or not we're allowed to get there. So right before that, we're going to add use authentication, which means we're going to add a step that allows the pipeline to stop and say, well, who the hell are you, if necessary. So real quick, let's take a moment to discuss how authentication typically works on the web. So if you think about a website like Facebook, when you get to a part of the website that you're not allowed to view as an unauthenticated person, it typically detects that you need to authenticate, and it redirects you to some process that logs you in, whether that be a form that has a username and password field, whether that be through a third party. If you think about like a web page that uses Facebook authentication but isn't Facebook, when it gets to this point, it typically redirects you to Facebook to collect your credentials, and that way the website authenticating you never actually gets your credentials, and then it redirects you back. But essentially, no matter how it needs to authenticate you, there's this step where it realizes you need to be authenticated. You typically get redirected someplace to be authenticated, and if you successfully authenticate, then you get redirected back to the resource you were trying to access. And the way that this is handled on the web, because the web is a stateless environment, is that once you authenticate and log in, the website typically sets a cookie on your browser that is used to track your session. That way you don't have to authenticate to every single page you access. Now, how long that session lasts and what the parameters around that cookie are, which domains it's valid for, and whether or not it's bound to the IP address you're coming from are semantics that are specific to each particular application. But in and of itself, the idea is that if we want to create a session where someone's logged in and they stay logged in, even if it's just for 5 minutes, there's going to need to be a cookie that is set on their browser. So what we're going to do now is up here under our services, we're going to add services.add authentication. And this takes a variety of different things, but we want to say that the default scheme is going to be, we're going to call it Wiki Auth. That's just going to be an identifier that we use for our authentication scheme. And if you look here, there's a bunch of different schemes that you can use. There's OAuth, which is a type of authentication where you get a token, and that token is good for a session, but every time you periodically that token expires, you have to go back for it. But pretty much most websites use cookie authentication. So we're going to do add cookie, and I'm going to call my authentication scheme Wiki Auth. And then there's options. If you look in the overload list, where is it? There you go, configure options. So if we go ahead and break that out, you can see that the options we have to configure, there's a bunch of them actually, and we can configure any number of these. So the big things that we're going to configure right now are the details about the cookie that's going to actually get set. So I'm going to give the cookie a name. We're just going to call it, we can call it Wiki Auth. It doesn't really matter. The user can see this if they go into their F12 on their browser or they're looking at like their raw HTTP traffic. So we don't want to name it anything derogatory. We want to set, for security purposes, it's always good to set HTTP only. What this means is that JavaScript and scripts running on the page really don't have access to this cookie. So it stifles some type of attacks, cross-site request forgery attacks, where a script running in one tab can make calls to a web server, and make like bank transfers on your behalf, even though it's not supposed to, and the server doesn't know any better because you're logged in, you're authenticated, you have the right cookie, you're allowed to do those things. It's just, it's just happening from something else in your browser and not really your own mouse click. So we want to set HTTP only. And then the other thing that we want to do is we want to set the security policy, and we want to say that always, which means that this cookie only applies to HTTPS connections. So let's go ahead and save this and see how this impacts what we have going on. So now if I go to settings, you'll notice that I get a 404. And if we take a look, we can see the web server tried to redirect me to /account/login. And this page obviously doesn't exist, but this is the default URL that the cookie authentication scheme attempts to send you to. Now I could easily create a page at /account/login, which will be our login form, but I'm going to use a different URL in a second. But the other thing to note is that it also passes a query string parameter called return URL, which represents the page that we're currently trying to access. This way, once we actually log in, the user winds up back at the page they were trying to get to. They don't just wind up at like the main page of our website. So we're pretty much on the right track now. ASP.NET Core understands that we're trying to access a resource that requires some level of authorization. Now, we haven't really told it who is allowed to access this, whether it be administrators or regular users or whatever. It just knows that we're not logged in, so it can't really do any kind of authorization yet. And it's trying to redirect us so that we can do authentication. We just haven't built that piece. So at this point, I'm going to create a couple pages that we're going to need. We're going to need a page to authenticate users, and we might rename these later. I'm just going to create them now just to show you how this all works. So we're going to create an auth page, which is going to be our login page. We're also going to create, oops, I did not mean to view in browser. I really hate that. Normally the add menu item is the first one in this list, but not usually. We're going to add the logout page. If you can log in, you should be able to log out. Otherwise, you're going to wind up with users having to delete their cookies in order to log out. We're going to create an account page, which is going to give some details about what account the user is currently authenticated to. And I'm also going to create a class under the root of the website called auth, which is where I'm going to put my authentication logic. So I'm going to make this a public static class, and we're going to put some static methods in here that are going to help deal with our authentication. Now real quick, let's go into our account page and let's create some markup here real quick. Let's create a table. And for now, the only thing we're going to put in here is logged in. And the way that we access authentication data in ASP.NET and ASP.NET Core is through the user property of the HTTP context. So in a page, it's accessible here, but it's also accessible through the HTTP context as user. So if we look under user, there's a reference to identity, claims, identities, and then there's some other methods like isEnroll, hasClaim. We'll talk about claims in a second, but for now I'm just going to say isAuthenticated. This is going to tell whether or not we're authenticated. So if I load up this account page, it should say false. It should say we're not authenticated, obviously, because we haven't built any way to actually authenticate. So if I pull this up, logged in, false, perfect. Now let's go one step further and say, well, if the user is logged in, then we're going to show some information about their account. So for now, we're just going to put the name in there. So we're going to say user identity.name. And no matter how you authenticate, no matter what your authentication scheme is, no matter what kind of user principal is like an account you're using, there's always a name. There's always a name, and the other attribute that comes out of the box is role. Not every authentication scheme populates a role. So if you think about a website where just like everyone has the same access, there might not be a meaningful role there, but there is the concept of a role. Now, if you go to user.isEnroll, you can tell if someone has a specific role. So in our wiki, we're going to have roles such as user for like every user that's registered, admin for the administrators that are allowed to control the entire wiki, and then you might have other roles like editor or moderator, things like that. So that's about it for the account page for now. So now let's create a login page. Because this is a shitty wiki, we're going to have a pretty shitty login page for now. Again, we'll expand on this later. So we're going to need a form. And we're going to collect a username. So input type equals text. And we're going to have a submit button. And notice for now I don't have a password. We'll come back and add passwords and an actual real authentication validating a user later. But for now we're just going to build a login page that just accepts any username, and that's who you're logged in as, just to demo how the authentication system works here. So in the view model, we're going to create a property for username, and we're going to bind to that property. And just like in our other pages, we're going to go back in here and use the tag helper to hook that up. And then in our view model, we're going to create an onPost, just like we did in our other pages where we accepted data. And now here's where we're going to go and reference up our authentication class. We're going to create some methods in here to handle logging in and logging out. So we're going to create some public static voids here. So log out and log in. And each of these is going to need to grab a reference to the HTTP context in order to work with the actual session, the request, the response, the cookies, all that good shit. And the logout is really easy. We're just going to say context.signoutAsync. And signoutAsync takes a single parameter. Hold on, we're going to have to import it. this lives in the ASP.NET Core authentication namespace. And it takes a single parameter, which is the authentication scheme, which we called it Wiki Auth. So our logout function is done. It pretty much signs the user out. And likewise, there's a sign in async function. Now, if you look here, this takes something called a claims principal. So let's talk about what that is. A claims principal, well, a principal in general is a entity. It's an authenticatable entity. Typically, you'd think about this as a user account. And what claims are a series of attributes which determine various things about an account that could be used in the authorization process. So like what role you are, if you're a user, if you're an admin, what your name is, what your email address is, what country you're in, potentially other specific data like first name or last name. For our purposes, it's pretty much anything associated with the account. So before we call that function, we're going to need to create a couple things. The first thing we're going to need to do is create a list of claims. So we're going to call this claims, and we're going to make a new list of claim, and we're going to have to import claim from the system security claims namespace. And our login function is going to need some information that's going to get passed in from the login page. We're going to need the username. We're going to need, I'm going to pull in something called auth type, because we're going to have different types of authentication later. We might have Active Directory. We might have users that might be stored in the database. We might have Facebook authentication or Google authentication. And we're also going to accept an array of roles. So once the backend system that's actually doing the validation pulls the data on who someone is, it's going to send us an array of roles, whether that be admin, editor, user, whatever. So we're going to go ahead and add some claims to our list here. The first one is going to be their name. So under claim types, there's all these built-in claim types. So you can see kind of what claims really are. They could be country, date of birth, DNS, email, home phone, name, whatever. So name is, again, like I mentioned before, name is something that's common to all identities. And for now, we're just going to set this to the user's username. The other thing that we're going to add in here is their role. And every user that authenticates to our website is going to at least get this user role. Now, there might be other roles that they get that gets pulled from AD based on groups or from the database based on permissions that we've assigned someone. But the user role is what we're going to give everyone that's actually logged into our website. If the user doesn't have the user role, we can consider them a guest. I'm also going to add a claim that's associated with their IP address. Now, I don't have to use these claim types. I could type my own string in here, which I'm going to, and I'm just going to grab their connection remote IP address, and we're just going to store that in there as well. And then we're going to go through all the roles are in roles that were provided to us by the login system. Hold on, I need another parentheses here. And we're going to add those. So, you know, you can have multiple claims with the same type. You could have multiple names, you could have multiple roles, whatever. In essence, it's like a one-to-many relationship. And now that we have our claims figured out, we're going to need to create a claims identity. So claims identity, call it I. And this accepts a number of things. The one that we care about here is this one. So we're going to pass in our list of claims. We're going to pass in our authentication type. And this is pretty unhelpful, the type of authentication used. Great. And now there's two parameters here, name type and role type. And what this is asking for is, well, which claim type represents the user's name? Well, that would be claim types.name. Because again, we could use any string we want here. And then the other thing ASP wants to know is which claim type represents their role. Because again, name and role are built-in constructs. You know, we can use these claims for other things like IP address, birthday, whatever the hell you want to do. But ASP.NET Core out of the box cares specifically about the user's name and what role they have. Presumably because most websites are gonna, you know, make use of that. Certainly the built-in templates that ASP uses care specifically about what someone's name is, that it can like show it in the bar at the top of the screen, and for logging purposes, and what role they have, so that authorization can actually like home in on what they're supposed to have access to. So now that we have a claims identity, we can create a claims principal, and this just gets our identity passed into it. And now we can pass that principal into our sign-in async function, and we are done with our login function. So let's go back to our auth page, and in our on post here, we're going to do two things. First of all, we're going to make the username required so that people can't just sign in with no username. You saw required on our last episode, so that means that we need to check the model state. So if the model state is not valid, then we're just going to stay on the same page. And then we're going to make a call to our login function. And so from here, we're going to pass in the HTTP context. We're going to pass in the username from the box they typed in. For now, we're going to say the auth type is shitty since we're not hooked into any backend database. And for now, we're just going to hard code that every user that logs in is an admin. So we're going to pass a string array that contains one element admin. And then once they log in, we're going to redirect them instead of redirecting them to the page that they were on, for now we're just going to redirect them to the account page. So let's go ahead and see what happens if we launch this up. So like before, if I go to account, we're not logged in. If I go to auth, we have our shitty login form. I'm going to say, hey, I'm Bob. And now we are logged in and our name is Bob. What do you know? Now I'm going to go ahead and go back to our startup class and add two things real quick. I'm going to tell our authentication provider that the login path is /auth so that it redirects people to the correct page when they access a page that they have to authenticate to. And I'm also going to provide the access denied path, which is a file we need to create. This is the page that they're going to wind up on if they are logged in, but they don't have access to the thing that they're trying to get to. So in other words, let's say a normal user logs in and they want to go to our administrative settings page or something like that. So we're going to create a page here called denied. And for now, we're just going to call it access denied. And now if I go to like that settings page, so if I go to /account, there's a good chance. Oh no, okay, good. So I'm not still logged in. So if I try to go to settings, it's going to redirect me to my login page. I log in as Bob. And then if I go back to settings, now I can access the page. Now let's go ahead and plumb in the logic for our logout page, which is pretty simple. In our logout page, we're just going to say auth.logout. And in our form, we're just going to say you have been logged out. And then the next thing I want to do is in our layout, I would like whether or not the user is logged in or not to appear at the top of the web page, as is pretty standard. You know, most websites, you look at the top right, you can see whether or not you're logged in. If you're not logged in, there's a login button. So we're going to go into our layout page here. And here's our nav area here. We're going to go ahead and add a item to our nav bar, which links to the account page. And the name of that link is going to be the user's name. So if you remember, user.identity.name. And then what we're going to do is we're going to say if the user is authenticated, then we're going to give them a logout button, which links to our logout page. Otherwise, we're going to give them, whoa, a login button. And we can put this inside of here so that there's only a username if they're logged in. So let's go ahead and see how all of this works together. So you can see here I'm not logged in, so I have a login button. If I go ahead and I log in as Bob, now I have Bob here, so that takes me to my account page. And then I have a login button, which if I click that, it says you have been logged out. And if I go back to the main page, you can see that Bob disappears. Now, one thing to note, which we're going to fix in a minute, is that when I go to the login page, up here, it still shows that I'm logged in. And the reason for that is because the user.identity is based on the current request. So the user has already authenticated by the time they hit our logout page. So even though we're logging them out as soon as they access the page, they've already authenticated for the duration of that request. So it's still, you know, the layout page is still going to show here that they're logged in. If I go ahead and hit F5 to refresh, then now they're completely logged out. Now it shows that they're not logged in, but that's something that we're going to take into account later on so that it's more intuitive. That way, the second they hit log out, their name disappears. Actually, let's go ahead and solve that issue right now. So without stopping the website, I'm going to go to the layout page, and I'm going to solve this by saying and model is, whoa, and not model is logout model. So basically, if the user's logged in and they're not on the logout page, that's when we're going to show this. If they're on the logout page, we're going to show this even though that they've been authenticated for the duration of the request. So let's go ahead and hit F5. This is going to take a second to recompile, and then we'll go ahead and test it. So we're going to log in, Bob. We're logged in, and now the second I hit the logout button, it looks like we've logged out properly. So that's fixed. Now, if we go ahead and we go back to our add page, if you remember, this is where we were allowing users to create a new page, and we had hard-coded the user that created the page to their IP address. Now, I could come in here and say something like, if the user.identity that is authenticated, then use the user's name. Otherwise, then use their request.http context.connection.remote IP address.toString. But the problem is that in a wiki, there's a higher than normal % chance that someone isn't authenticated. There's a lot of things that you can typically do. You know, if you go to Wikipedia right now, you can create a page without logging in. So in order to not have to put this check every single place where we need the current user's username. Now, I mean, we could make a function that just says, you know, get current user's username. But one way to show off the robustness of the authentication model is to implicitly log in users that aren't logged in as an account as their IP address and give them a different role, such as guest. And that allows us to have claims, to have roles for users that don't have an account, and various things. So let's real quick see how we would do this. So I'm actually just going to leave this as user.identity.name. I'm going to go into my auth thing here. I'm going to create a new function called Implicit Login. And we're going to require the HTTP context. And we're pretty much going to do the same exact thing that we do when someone actually logs into an account. The difference is that instead of having a username, we're going to use their connection remote IP address toString as their username. We're going to give them the guest role. They're not going to get any, they can still have an IP address, but they're not going to get any additional roles. And the auth type, we're just going to call it guest. And that way we can use the authentication type to differentiate between someone that's a guest, someone that's logged in through, let's say, Active Directory, someone that's used some type of Facebook authentication, something along those lines. And everything else here remains the same. Now we want this implicit login function to run pretty much anytime someone hits any page on our website if they're not already authenticated as a user. So there's a couple ways that we could do this. One way is that if you look under pages, there's this view start.cshtml, and this essentially runs anytime the system goes to process a view. It's where you determine which layout a view gets. And I could put code in here that does that, but the proper way to do it is to create a page filter. So I'm going to go up here and create a new folder in my project called filters, and I'm going to add a class. We're going to call it auth filter, and this is going to give us some versatility because it's going to allow us to do any kind of other housekeeping that we need to do when someone hits any page across the entire wiki. And the way that this works is that we implement something called iPageFilter. So this has to be, this has to be imported. So that comes from MVC filters. And then we're going to implement it. Boink. And there's 3 functions. Let's remove these not implemented exceptions because we don't want our website to crash. There's 3 functions in here. And this bottom one is going to get fired first. It's going to get fired when the system looks at the route and determines which page someone is actually going to. And it's possible in this function to override various parameters that determine which page someone's going to get. Once it determines which page it's going to start rendering, this function, onPageHandlerExecuting, runs first. Then it renders the page, and then onPageHandlerExecuted runs last. So this happens before the page renders, this happens after the page renders. So here's where we're going to actually put the code here. And if we look in here, there's a bunch of various properties. This is not an HTTP context, this is a page handler executing context. And handler instance is actually a reference to the view model of the page that we're actually about to load. So all we're going to say is if the user is not in role called user, in other words, if they're anyone that hasn't logged into an actual account, then we're going to do auth implicit login, and we're going to pass context.http context in. And now all we have to do is register this filter in our startup class. So we're going to go here, and the way that we do this is services.addMVC, which has an option for filters, and then all we have to do is add the type of the class that we created, so auth filter. Actually, it's filters.authFilter because I put it into a folder. So real quick, let's go back to our layout page, and instead of saying user.identity.isAuthenticated, we're going to say user.isEnroll user, since theoretically everyone's going to be pre-authenticated as something. And on our account page, which I'm going to have to open over here, we're not going to do this logged in shit anymore. Instead, we're going to say we also don't need this is authenticated anymore, because theoretically everyone's going to be authenticated. Instead, we're going to say for each var r in user.claims, we're going to create a row that shows the claim type and the claim value. Now if I go ahead and run the site, you can see that it acts as if I'm not logged in. But if I actually go to the account page, you can see that I really am logged in. I'm logged in as a guest. That way, user.identity.name is always going to refer to the right thing. And if I want to tell the difference between a user and a guest or whatever, I just have to look at the role. So now let's just log in as Bob. And you can see now I'm logged in as Bob. If I go ahead and log out, and then I go back to the account page, you see what happened there? The first time I logged out, like here, let's go back to log out, and then go back to the account page. I'm not pre-authenticated. And the reason for that is because the implicit handler hasn't run until after this request fired. So this first request here, even though it literally just implicitly logged me in, like I mentioned before, the user.identity hasn't updated because at the beginning of the request, I wasn't authenticated. So all we really have to do to fix that is that in our logout function under auth.cs, we just have to say once someone is signed out, then we just implicitly log them in immediately. And that should resolve that issue. So now if I go to account, I'm implicitly logged in. If I were to manually log myself out and go back to the account page, voila. Now the last thing we want to do before we end this video is I want to show you how you actually authorize a user to a specific role. So we made 2 pages. We made edit, which every user is going to be able to get to, even if they're a guest, at least for the bulk of the pages by default. You know, we may have protected pages or what have you later. But our settings page should only be able to be accessed by administrators. So all we have to do is in this authorized attribute, we just say roles equal admin. Now let's go ahead and test this. Here we go. We're visibly not logged in, but if we really go to account, we're implicitly logged in. If I go to the edit page, I can get to the edit page, and if I try to make an edit, it would know that my user account is my IP address. But if I try to go to the settings page, here's where we get our access denied message because we're not logged in as an administrator. Now, one thing we might want to do is in our access denied page, we might want to say, okay, well, if the user isn't actually logged in with a real account, then redirect them to the auth page. Otherwise, keep them here. And what that's going to do is if they're not really logged in as an account, then they're going to get the sign-in page. If they are logged in as an account, but they don't have the admin permission, then they're going to see the access denied page, if that makes any sense. So just to test this out, let's go back to our auth page. Let's create a role. Let's make it required. And by default, we'll set it to user. Well, actually, let's set it to admin. And then we'll create another input box here. Call it role. And then instead of hard coding this, we'll just forward that through. And this is going to allow us to test out what happened. I missed a semicolon someplace. Here we go. This is going to allow us to test out our authorization, right? So I'm going to log in. Now, if I log in as an admin and I try to go to the settings page, I can get there. If I log out and log in, and let's say I give myself a different role, let's say we're Martha and we're just an editor, and now I go to the settings page, now access is denied. But, you know, I'm still Martha, and you can see here that I'm an editor and a user, but I'm not an admin. So that pretty much takes us to the end of the video. Once again, if you have any questions, anything that you think I could have done differently, anything along those lines, any feedback, comment below. If you like this video and you want to see more in the series, go ahead and like, subscribe, consider supporting me on Patreon. And in our next video, we're actually going to hook our authentication into an actual database, whether it be Active Directory or whether we're going to store user accounts in our SQL server. But instead of just allowing anyone to go to the login page and hard coding some roles, we're actually going to create a system of identities, users, roles, and other associated metadata. As always, stay safe. Cheers.